Welcome back, guys, and if you're new here, welcome to the channel. Today, I'm continuing a series on some of Tolkien's stories of romance between members of Middle-earth's different peoples. Earlier videos have looked at Thingol and Melian, Andreth and Aignor, Beren and Luthien, and Tuur and Idril, which means today I'll be talking about the tale of Aragorn and Arwen. Briefly recounted, their story goes something like this. Aragorn II was born in the year 2931 of the Third Age, the latest heir to the chieftainship of the northern Dunedain and, more technically, heir to the thrones of Gondor and Arnor. Just 2 years later, his father is killed, and the boy and his mother move to Imladris, where Aragorn is raised and educated by Elrond, who comes to look on him as a son. To keep the young heir safe, his identity is hidden even from him, and he's given the name Estel, a Sindarin term meaning unwavering hope. As he matures, he often rides out with Elrond's older children, Elladan and Elrohir, but Elrond's daughter Arwen is away visiting her grandparents in Lothlorien, so it's some time before the two meet. When Aragorn is 20, Elrond reveals his heritage and gives him some of the heirlooms of his house, the Ring of Barahir and the Shards of Narsil. However, Elrond withholds the Scepter of Annúminas, as it represents rule over the realms of the Dunedain, a status that young Aragorn has yet to secure. The next day, Aragorn goes for a stroll, feeling a bit giddy, as most 20-year-olds would, at learning that they really have been special all along. He's singing about Beren and Luthien when he espies a beautiful dark-haired stranger and chases after her, calling out to Nuviel just as his famous ancestor did ages before. To his consternation, he finds that the woman he's run into is no vision out of legend, but Elrond's flesh-and-blood daughter, home for a visit. Poor Aragorn is instantly smitten, but Arwen finds him more amusing than impressive, and Aragorn sinks into the depressive throes of unrequited young love. Both his mother and his adoptive father soon figure out what his problem is, and warn him that he may have bitten off more than he can chew. Aragorn's mother Gilrain has pragmatic concerns. Without the goodwill of Master Elrond, the heirs of Isildur will soon come to an end. But I do not think that you will have the goodwill of Elrond in this matter. For his part, Elrond observes that at this point, with his high inheritance rotting around him and the probable end of civilization looming ever closer, any kind of romantic entanglement is a costly distraction at best, and a dishonorable retreat into ignominy at worst. He also admits that if his adoptive son were to win the heart of his daughter, it would mean tremendous personal suffering for him. He explains the somewhat complicated metaphysical standing of his particular branch of the half-elven, that so long as I abide here, she shall live with the youth of the Eldar, and when I depart, she shall go with me if she so chooses. But there will be no choice before Arwen, my beloved, unless you, Aragorn, Arathorn's son, come between us, and bring one of us, you or me, to a bitter parting beyond the end of the world. In any case, Elrond considers Aragorn's chances with Arwen rather dismal. As for Arwen the Fair, Lady of Imladris and of Lorien, even star of her people, she is of lineage greater than yours, and she has lived in the world already so long that to her you are but as a yearling shoot beside a young birch of many summers. She is too far above you, and so, I think, it may well seem to her. After this conversation, Aragorn sets out, determined to live up to his newly discovered title and heritage. For nearly 30 years he wanders the wild, serving both Stewart Ecthelion of Gondor and King Thengel of Rohan, until he becomes the hardened ranger we all know and love. Eventually he ends up passing through Lorien during one of Arwen's visits. Galadriel, who like most of her family is doom-savvy, cleans Aragorn up a bit and unleashes him on her granddaughter. This time, Arwen finds herself very impressed by her suitor, and on Midsummer's Eve, as the beams of the setting sun play ever so romantically around the hill of Carin Amroth, they plighted their troth and were glad. Elrond is understandably not thrilled about this, and reiterates that he expects Aragorn to provide Arwen with prospects that befit her nobility, nothing short of queenship over Gondor and Arnor, which likely requires some solution to the problem of Sauron to boot. Arwen Undomiel shall not diminish her life's grace for less cause. To me, then, even our victory can bring only sorrow and parting, but to you, hope of joy for a while. So, for another 38 years, while Arwen watches over him in thought from Rivendell, Aragorn continues his labors, waiting and hoping for his shot. This finally appears in the form of 4 painfully inexperienced hobbits, one of whom is in possession of the fate of the world. As recounted in The Lord of the Rings, hijinks ensue, and finally, with the throne reclaimed and the Dark Lord soundly defeated, Aragorn welcomes Arwen to Minas Tirith as his bride. She bids farewell to her father, who sails on to Valinor without her, and together Arwen and Aragorn rule in great glory and bliss for 60 years, until Aragorn finally feels old age approaching and relinquishes his life. Here, the otherwise heartwarming story takes a startlingly dark turn, for when it comes down to it, Arwen does not demurely embrace the gift of men at Aragorn's side. She still feels full of life and vigor, and isn't ready to die just yet. She pleads with Aragorn for more time, and although he is the one on his deathbed, it's Aragorn who ends up consoling her. In despair after his passing, Arwen leaves Minas Tirith and finds her way to the now deserted woods of Lothlorien, where finally she lays herself on Caer Namroth and dies, and there is her green grave until the world is changed, and all the days of her life are utterly forgotten by men that come after. After the publication of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien would comment on the great importance of the story of Aragorn and Arwen. He listed it as being one of the 3 great unions between the Eldar and the Edain, highlighted its similarities with the story of Beren and Luthien, and saw it as a critical part of the book's exploration of death as the part of the nature, physical and spiritual, of man, and hope without guarantees. That is why I regard the tale of Arwen and Aragorn as the most important of the appendices. It is part of the essential story, and is only placed so because it could not be worked into the main narrative without destroying its structure. So it's somewhat surprising to learn that the idea of Aragorn and Arwen's romance hadn't even occurred to Tolkien until relatively late in the composition of The Lord of the Rings. Aragorn's character alone took some time to acquire its familiar form. His role was first filled by a hobbit with wooden feet called Trotter, and even after he'd acquired the status of Isildur's heir, Tolkien briefly considered having him marry Éowyn. It wasn't until he approached the novel's conclusion that Tolkien started including notes about the marriage of Aragorn and Elrond's daughter, who at first bore the name Finduilas. Even in the final published novel, we see very few hints of Arwen's true significance to Aragorn in the main text, and what hints we do get only become fully clear in hindsight. In their Reader's Companion to The Lord of the Rings, Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull observe that although Arwen was a late addition, putting her in the story did not involve much additional text or rewriting, since the tale is told mainly from the viewpoint of Frodo and the other hobbits, and we learn no more about the relationship than they do. They and we, on a first reading, are equally surprised when Arwen arrives at Minas Tirith to marry Aragorn. Despite how minimally it's referred to in the book, the story of Aragorn and Arwen is Tolkien's best-known love story, largely because it was a major subplot in the Peter Jackson film trilogy of the early 2000s. The decision to place more emphasis on their relationship was probably a wise one. Films don't really have appendices, after all, so to justify Arwen's sudden appearance in Minas Tirith, some kind of expectation and build-up had to be established with the audience beforehand. However, the film's portrayal of this romance has led to some misconceptions, and this seems as good a place as any to briefly address them. In the books, Arwen is only in a position to make the choices she does because of her mortal ancestry, something that's glossed over in the films. This has naturally led some viewers to conclude that sacrificing immortality for love is theoretically possible for elves in general. But in Tolkien's account, elves cannot voluntarily give up their immortality, for love or any other reason. Even elves who fade from grief or meet violent ends have a different fate than men. Elvish spirits are bound to the world and typically end up re-embodied sooner or later. Men die much more finally, their spirits departing Arda for realms unknown. In the films, it is suggested that Arwen suffers a malady that's analogous to the general fading of the elves, and that her recovery depends on the defeat of Sauron, which is why film Elrond finally makes peace with her marriage to Aragorn, and why Aragorn in turn is motivated to assume the role of king, which he was earlier reluctant to fully embrace. This is quite different from the story we read in the book, where before he even meets Arwen, Aragorn has already been told that, whether he succeeds or fails, he is the one destined to finally determine the fate of his kindred. He spends several decades in serious pursuit of this goal before Arwen even really takes notice of him. Despite their painful conflict of interests, Aragorn and Elrond remain on reasonably good terms throughout the relationship's development, and far from chafing under the restraints of her overbearing father and the indecision of her self-doubting lover, Arwen appears quite content with the conditions set on their marriage. Indeed, there's some suggestion that she contributed to setting them. As descendants of all the previous comparable marriages we've discussed, Aragorn and Arwen naturally exhibit some similarities to earlier couples. Like Tuor and Idril, they eschew an anonymous life of woodland seclusion in favor of becoming the dominant power couple of their era, birthing heirs and defending populaces as necessary. We also see echoes of their shared Maiaran heritage in their apparently supernatural talents. Like several of her foremothers, Arwen seems to have a good measure of foresight as well as quite respectable weaving skills, while Aragorn's healing prowess is seen as a mark of his kingship. But the couple they are most often compared to is Beren and Luthien. When Aragorn first meets Arwen, he's singing about Luthien and initially thinks Arwen is a vision of her. She confirms that many have told her she resembles Luthien, and even adds that she might end up with a similar fate. Like Beren, Aragorn is given a quest to achieve by his beloved's father. This is also the relationship that ends the most similarly to Beren and Luthien's, with both parties ultimately accepting mortal death. As firmly as the text seems set on emphasizing the parallels between Aragorn and Arwen and Beren and Luthien, it's interesting to note how superficial a lot of these similarities are. Like Beren, Aragorn is the de facto heir to a dispossessed tribe of men, who seeks refuge in a hidden elven enclave after the death of his father. But while Beren is threatened and ultimately cast out by Thingol, Aragorn is welcomed in as a kinsman and raised by Elrond almost as if he were his own son. Beren enters Doriath having already achieved great feats against the servants of Morgoth, and can boast of about the highest lineage it's possible for a mortal to claim in the First Age. But Thingol is unimpressed by this and requires him to retrieve the Silmaril, a priceless work of craft, before he'll consider him worthy of his daughter. Having already won Luthien's heart, Beren therefore undertakes his quest primarily to prove his worth to Thingol. Aragorn, on the other hand, is given many of the priceless artifacts of his household, including the Ring of Barahir, when Elrond reveals his true identity. What he lacks are the deeds to prove he is worthy of his high doom. Before Arwen will even consider his suit, he has to demonstrate that he really is capable of restoring his kin, long sunk in obscurity, to their former glory. Elrond states the nature of the bargain they are all negotiating the most baldly, and ends up taking some heat for apparently setting his foster son the same kind of impossible quest his ancestor Thingol gave to Beren, using his daughter as bait. But that doesn't seem like a fair representation of the situation. Beren ends up entangled with the Silmaril only because he fell in love with Luthien, and agreed to meet her parents. She therefore seems to feel some sense of responsibility for helping him. Restoring the lost kingdoms of the Dunedain, by contrast, is understood by all parties to be Aragorn's personal task, one that falls on his shoulders by virtue of his birth, regardless of his relationship status. And that is probably part of the reason that, unlike her ancestress, Arwen doesn't actively accompany Aragorn on his quest. The most visible distinction between the two couples comes at the ends of their stories. Luthien is insistent that she and Beren should be together at all costs. Upon his first death, she quickly fades from life, arriving in the halls of Mandos to demand Beren's return. Neither Luthien nor the Valar can change Beren's nature, which requires that he eventually leave the world forever. But although warned that she has no guarantee of a happy ending, Luthien is still determined that whatever grief might lie in wait, the fates of Beren and Luthien might be joined, and their paths lead together beyond the confines of the world. Given the similarities between Arwen and Luthien in particular, one might expect Arwen to embrace death for the sake of her beloved a bit less reluctantly. However, she balks when faced with the reality of death, despite presumably knowing exactly what she was getting into when she and Aragorn plighted their troth on Cairn Amroth. For one thing, Aragorn has already spelled it out for her. warning at their betrothal, "The shadow I utterly reject, but neither, lady, is the twilight for me. For I am mortal, and if you will cleave to me, even star, then the twilight you must also renounce." Arwen, for her part, does not appear to be making her decision lightly, and she stood then as still as a white tree looking into the west, and at last she said, "I will cleave to you, Dunadan, and turn from the twilight, yet there lies the land of my people and the long home of all my kin." Aragorn reminds her of this moment on his deathbed, and she agrees it's too late to change her mind, but finds little comfort in that knowledge. "That choice is long over, and I must indeed abide the doom of men, whether I will or nill, the loss and the silence. But I say to you, King of the Númenóreans, not till now have I understood the tale of your people and their fall. As wicked fools I scorned them, but I pity them at last. For if this is indeed, as the Eldar say, the gift of the One to men, it is bitter to receive." It isn't until nearly a year after Aragorn's death that Arwen makes good on her commitment. The romantic ideal portrayed in the Beren and Luthien story is in some ways quite a contemporary one. As a penniless, disinherited outlaw, Beren can only offer Luthien his love and personal regard, and Luthien, the cherished princess of one of Beleriand's oldest, safest, and most affluent realms, throws away everything solely for Beren's sake. The story is romantic with a capital R, emphasizing the worth of the subjective feelings and experiences of two individuals. Beren and Luthien value their love more than literally every other possible motivation: safety, material wealth, political power, loyalty, friendship, and family. That's the point of the story, as Beren pointed out by asking for a Silmaril as a bride price, however sarcastically. Thingol has reduced his daughter's market value to that of an inanimate object, albeit a very sparkly one. And as the rest of the story shows, a person's inherent dignity and worth can't be calculated so coldly. Aragorn and Arwen's approach seems to instead share elements with the tradition of courtly love, a paradigm that ironically Tolkien professed to dislike, at least its more decadent, frivolous forms. Like any good chivalrous lover, Aragorn dedicates himself to undertaking great feats to prove his devotion to his lady, and she does not seem terribly interested in him until he's demonstrated not only personal maturation, but that he really might stand a chance of restoring the fortunes of mankind. In contrast to Beren's Silmaril quest, the demand placed on Aragorn has more to do with the kinds of opportunities he can provide to Arwen, who, we are told, is so wise and noble that nothing short of rule over 2 kingdoms and the chance to found a thriving dynasty will offer sufficient scope for her talents. This observation is not meant as criticism of either story. Beren, Aragorn, Luthien, and Arwen all make tremendous sacrifices for the sake of their relationship. Like Luthien, Arwen embraces not just her lover but his entire people, taking them for her own. Her appreciation for the important role that Aragorn alone can offer her in no way detracts from her personal affection for him. But this does give some idea of why Arwen reacts to Aragorn's death as she does, because from the start of their relationship, she has loved the potential that Aragorn represents. The possibility of a new beginning, a hope beyond what it is reasonable to hope for. It's no mistake that of his many names, the one she uses for him is Estel. What Arwen failed to fully realize was that, by their very nature, men don't get to stick around to see whether all that potential will ever be truly fulfilled. If they've done it right, much of what they achieve in their short lifespans will only bear fruit generations down the line. Arwen may not mind the idea of mortal death in the abstract, but Aragorn is asking her to leave the world in other hands, before she has grown weary of it. Aragorn understands the need for this, but then again he was born into this understanding. Arwen grew up with a very different view of history and her own place in it. Her aftername, Undomiel, means evening star, a source of light and beauty arising in the last days of the twilight of the elves. It's also likely a reference to the Star of Eärendil, sometimes called Gil Estel, which appears in the twilight of both dusk and dawn. Before the War of the Ring, Arwen spent a lot of time with her grandparents in Lothlorien, where, due to the influence of Galadriel's ring Nenya, the ravages of time were not so easily felt. Though the beauty of Lorien has an undeniably melancholy tinge, Still, it must have made it easy to believe that the twilight of the elves might just continue on indefinitely, as indeed the elves themselves are wont to do. Even the seasons are experienced differently in Lorien. Legolas tells Frodo that the Malorn trees of the Golden Wood don't drop their leaves until the first buds of spring emerge, which means that in all seasons, even in winter, the forest is roofed with gold. It's in Lothlorien that Arwen meets Aragorn a second time and sees the surprising degree to which he's fulfilled the promises of his youth. She decides she would rather illuminate the dawn of the Age of Men than continue presiding over the elves' final waning. But mornings, by definition, don't last forever, and all mortals have to face their own personal twilight, and relinquish their lives on Earth so that their children and grandchildren can rise in their turn. Moreover, as Arwen is no doubt starting to realize, in Arda everything that has a beginning, no matter how grand and glorious, eventually decays and passes away, even though she and Aragorn have placed mankind on the best possible trajectory. Everything they've worked for will sooner or later fall apart and be forgotten. When Arwen returns to Lorien, or what's left of it, she gets to experience this firsthand. The elves are no longer fading, but faded, and the woods they loved are forsaken and empty, as vulnerable to the passage of time as any other place in Middle-earth. Finally, when the Malorn leaves were falling but spring had not yet come, she laid herself to rest upon Cairn Amroth, and with the passing of Evenstar, no more is said in this book of the days of old. That's why, despite its obvious similarities to Beren and Luthien, in its ending the story of Aragorn and Arwen most reminds me of a different legendary romance, that of Andreth and Aignor. Before he dies, Aragorn tells Arwen that she now faces the uttermost choice, to bear away into the west the memory of our days together that shall there be ever green, but never more than memory, or else to abide the doom of men. According to what Finrod once told Andreth, Aignor elected the first option, for the life and love of the Eldar dwells much in memory, and we, if not ye, would rather have a memory that is fair but unfinished, than one that goes on to a grievous end. As she explains to Aragorn, Arwen really doesn't have that choice anymore. Of course, there's the practical question of who would build her a ship to sail west in now that Círdan is gone, but we find out later that Legolas and Gimli find a way around that, and plus, that's not really the point Arwen's making. Unlike Aignor, she didn't preserve a fair but unfinished memory to meditate on for the rest of time. Instead, she grasped what was offered, experienced all that life with her beloved could bring, and so came at last to an end more grievous than she could have imagined. For as Finrod said, such barters are paid for in anguish that cannot be guessed until it comes, and in ignorance, rather than in courage, the Eldar judge that they are made. In the ending of the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, we see the bitterness that's a part of even the most triumphant love story. The bitterness Finrod foresaw when he predicted that a quick death would be the least cruel end for a marriage between the Eldar and the Edain. People often consider this a bit of an overstatement on Finrod's part, but Arwen's story provides pretty compelling evidence for his claim. Aragorn and Arwen had so much joy and love in their very long lives that Arwen, at least, is tempted to linger in the world past her time. But in Lothlorien, once the very heart of elvendom on earth, she sees firsthand the grimness of living to witness the decay of all that was once fair and loved. It's only then that she accepts the gift of men, forsaking the hollow promises of the world, leaving it behind to go seeking Estel. If you enjoyed this unexpectedly morbid look at one of Tolkien's comparatively cheerful love stories, descend like a doom long foreseen upon the like button. Subscribe if you'd like to see more of this kind of thing, and let me know in the comments whether you think Arwen made the right call. For more of my thoughts on this and other topics, you can check out my Patreon site by following the link in the description below. Thank you to everyone for watching, and particular thanks to my patrons, including Catherine Berry, Dr. Newton Wen, Sophie's Boy, John H. Austin Jr., Gandalf the Grey, Marcel Ribeiro, Nick Rialo, Jeremy Buckingham, Kevin Gilstat, Dorwin Gray, Brendan Mooney, E. Rose B., Allison Kreutzberg, Frankie 12 String, Luke, Joel Bion, and Jared Carver.